This video is an overview of the Canadian political system, and I'm going to touch on uh, the basics of the system as well as how the different parts of this system relates to each other and overall structure of it. In other videos, I'm going to details on how each part of the system works and elaborate on that. Now I'm going to just start and go over each of these pieces with a quick overview and some comments on how each of these institutions relate to each other. And this is, of course, very much informed by this entire map. And this way of thinking about politics is very much informed by systems theory. It's a very typical map in that sense, where we have at the bottom here the people. They elect their representatives to the legislature, in this case to the House of Commons, and the House of Commons elects an executive, and the executive steers the administration, which produces output, social services, and policy that affects the people, and the people can then evaluate that. So it goes in the circle. That's the general sense of how it should function. Now, this map here will tell a practiced observer that we're talking about a parliamentarian system because of the dependency of the executive on the legislature. If the executive can't maintain the confidence of the legislature, it will have to go. And that can be contrasted to presidential systems, for instance, in the United States, where the executive can remain in office regardless of the legislature and its attitude towards the executive. So here in Canada, if the executive can't get a budget bill passed, there will be a new election or at least a new executive. The government will fall, and most likely the Governor General will want to see a new election coming. But that's not what would happen in the United States. So let's go over each of these pieces one by one really fast. First of course, the people, and here I'm going to focus mostly on political parties and how they're organized, and the party systems and how different political parties have related to each other over time in Canadian politics. Moving on, I'm also going to discuss in a different video elections, the main part here being the first past the post system, but also how elections are organized and fundraising and participation. The legislature, of course, when the people vote, the winners in the election become members of parliament. So note here that the arrow only goes to the House of Commons. Senators in Canada, of course, are not popularly elected. And also important to note, in this parliamentary system, this is founded on the Westminster system, the Westminster model of parliamentarism. So we're talking about a fusion of powers between the legislature and the executive. And we're talking about legislative sovereignty, also known as parliamentary supremacy. So the sovereignty of the Canadian federal state lies formally within Parliament. Parliament makes the decisions, and the executive has to obey those decisions, which is why an executive that wants to be able to function needs a majority of the seats in the House of Commons. So Parliament is really at the heart of the system. That's the key formal body, the supreme expression of popular will within the Canadian parliamentary system. And that's important to note, because when we hear discussions about how the executive works in relation to Parliament, there is the sense sometimes that Parliament is just a rubber stamp of the government, but that's only the case in majority governments. And even when it seems to be the case, that doesn't really remove from Parliament being at the heart of the functionality. So when we hear commentators discussing the importance of Parliament for the Canadian political system, that's what they have in mind. So going on with the executive, there is the Queen and the Queen's representative, the Governor General, being the head of state. This is mostly symbolic, but it also has some, during particular flashpoints in time, it actually does have some practical significance. The Prime Minister being the head of government and arguably the most powerful individual within the Canadian political system. Also, I will talk about, it's also important to acknowledge cabinet and the role of members of cabinet, ministerial responsibility in cabinet, solidarity and collective responsibility. Moving on, of course, the executive runs the administration, and it's important then to discuss how the administration can control the bureaucracy and what types of organizations exist within the bureaucracy, the government departments, administrative agencies, crown corporations, and so on, and trends in how this has been run by governments over time. Canada is a constitutional monarchy, and as such, there is a constitution and Supreme Court to watch over that constitution, and how the constitution has shaped Canadian politics and continues to be significant for Canadian politics, and particularly perhaps Canadian federalism, is something that also has to be discussed in greater detail. Which brings us to the subject of federalism. Canada is a federal country with 10 provinces and 3 territories. It has thus a system of shared sovereignty between the federal, state, and the provinces. It's a very decentralized federation, more decentralized generally speaking than, say, the United States of America. So that makes it quite different in terms of the political dynamics of Canada compared to the country that informed the blueprints for the Canadian Constitution and system of government. In other words, the United Kingdom, of course, being a unitary country. So Canada, by virtue of its geographic size, the diversity of regions, by virtue of the economic diversity that comes out of that size, and by virtue of the constitutional sharing of sovereignty between the federal and provincial government, has some really interesting dynamics going on between these levels of government that are also, when we talk about this whole configuration about government and the process of accountability in the democratic steering chain, of course, the media deserves some attention because it's a primary broker of information between the people and the government, and then I mean all parts of government, legislature, executive, and administration. It is called the fourth estate for a reason. It's called this because it is a watchdog, and it's a really important part of holding all levels of government accountable to the people. And come election day, the media will have played a very significant role in how the people will act and vote, and thus exercise its powers of accountability over the elected representatives in the House of Commons. So all of these parts of the Canadian system will be examined in greater detail in further videos, so watch them. And thank you for watching this quick overview of the Canadian political system.